They rode down towards Marker River. Just then Gunnar's horse stumbled, and he had to leap from the saddle. He happened to glance up towards his home and the slopes of Hlíðarendi. "How lovely the slopes are," he said, "more lovely than they had ever seemed to me before, golden cornfields and new-mown hay. I am going back home, and I will not go away." Kolskegg said, "Do not make your enemies happy by breaking the settlement, something that no one would ever expect of you, for you can be quite sure that all of Njál's predictions will come true." "I am not going away," said Gunnar, "and I wish you would stay too." These final words are spoken by the charismatic and tragic hero Gunnar of Hlíðarendi in the medieval Icelandic epic Brennu-Njáls saga. Gunnar is Njál Thorgesson's, the titular character's, best friend. See, Gunnar has found himself in some trouble with the law, and for various reasons that we don't need to get into, he has found himself outlawed from the country. He needs to leave Iceland for 3 years, and he is set to abide by that law and go. His best friend, Njál, Iceland's best lawyer and best advisor, has also advised Gunnar to just go if he wants to survive. So reluctantly, Gunnar begins to leave. He begins to leave his home and head south to the coast and to a boat. But just before he passes over the first hill, he, like Lot's wife perhaps, glances back and sees the glorious splendor of the Icelandic countryside. And then he speaks those ill-fated words that I just read. And so he stays in Iceland, breaking the law and thus putting a bounty on his head. And he hunkers down in his home and prepares to defend himself from the men that he knows will come bearing axes and swords to enforce the law. This scene is the epigraph to Dominic Cooper's 1975 novel, The Dead of Winter, which was published by St. Martin's Press. Like the world of Brennu-Njáls saga, the world of The Dead of Winter is a world in the midst of change, and a world where men's reputation and men's honor are always on the line, where running from a fight is far worse than dying in that fight. The change in Njála is the conversion to Christianity, which Iceland undertook in the year 999 or 1000, and all of the cultural and societal shifts that occurred with that conversion. And the changing world in the dead of winter is the oncoming of modernity, sometime perhaps in the late 19th century or early 20th century on the western islands of Scotland. Alistair Moore lives on a remote island in western Scotland, where all the other residents of the island, which used to be quite populated, have slowly but surely over the last couple of decades moved off onto the mainland, mainly to find work. Alistair is the island's last holdout, as he refuses to leave behind his inheritance. He lives all alone in a very small croft and makes a living simply farming and fishing, and once a week he'll row across the bay to the mainland to sell his quite measly yield. He raises animals and lives the simple but noble life of a completely ordinary fisherman and farmer. And so I'm sure you can tell from the very basic description that this book is in that genre of man versus modernity that authors like Halldór Laxness, Knut Hamsun, John Steinbeck all write in. It's not a wholly original idea necessarily, but Cooper really does separate himself from those other kinds of authors by exploring this problem, this conflict, primarily through description. What I really like about this book is that while it's in that very well-trodden genre of man versus modernity or man versus change, the way Cooper goes about telling this story is super unique. His prose style is very focused on description as we maintain this very distant third-person perspective. And we rarely get dialogue. Most of the word count of this book is spent describing the natural world. It feels like at times that it isn't Alistair who is our primary character, but the land around him, the land itself. Alistair is just a piece of the land, no more important than the mountains or the sheep that roam on those mountains. And so there is this focus in this book on these elemental forces, on the land and the ocean around that land and the weather, as it's these three things that really govern Alistair's daily existence. He's completely dependent on, and therefore subservient, to the land itself. And that's really what this book is about. There is a plot, don't get me wrong, but the driving force of this book is the descriptions of the natural world, the elements that control our livelihoods. We hear of Alistair's backstory, of his very long lineage that has inhabited this island for generations, and we hear about how they've slowly died away or have slowly moved away to the mainland, abandoning both the land itself and him, abandoning both him and the land. Early in the novel, we hear that Alistair's brother David left the land a long time ago and never came back, and Alistair thinks. The years since his brother's departure stretched behind him in a belt of time in which there were few landmarks beyond the recurring seasons. But he was only aware of the length of his life alone when he began to think of David and his old father. And even in the first months after David had left, when a prolonged winter had kept him off the sea and reduced him to chewing the sour, raw berries of the rowan tree, even then it had never occurred to him to follow David's example and leave home in search of an easier life. He squeezed the rock. This was his land, his sea. These he knew. This book doesn't depict an idyllic relationship between Alistair and the land, though, as Alistair's life is difficult, and it only gets more and more difficult as time goes on, as his way of life is becoming more and more strained, as industry increasingly makes the individual farmer more and more obsolete. But nature isn't the antagonist here. I said earlier that this book is in that genre of man versus nature, but that's not quite true. The main conflict here is Alistair trying to live symbiotically with the land, which is incredibly difficult, especially as the title suggests, well, winter is coming. This then was the night. And so each day, for all anyone might do to prevent it, the land, in a close alliance with the treacherous, deceiving sun, gained back from men the little they seemed to have claimed for themselves. For on those barren shores, it was in the light and heat that human existence showed itself. And at this hour, these small, fluttering pennants seemed near to being destroyed forever. The years had whittled away at the village until only its strongest and most obstinate inhabitant was left. Alistair Moore, great in love as he was, great in strength, held on to this life with a steeled and unmoving passion. And so, with the harshest months of the year quickly approaching, in comes the primary antagonist of this book, the emblem of modernity, a character right out of folklore, An-Shanach, whose name literally just translates to the fox. We don't learn too much about An-Shanach other than that he is a foreigner encroaching on Alistair Moore's land. And he's a tricky and sly man, as his name implies, as he begins to cheat and steal from Alistair in a way that really threatens Alistair's livelihood. Alistair Moore and An-Shanach are diametrically opposed forces who will inevitably crash into each other. And like any good Icelandic saga or any good Western, these two forces do collide in a pretty epic face-off. And this face-off is interesting and inevitable, and it does drive this novel as these two forces are continually coming closer and closer to each other, and we're just waiting for them to hit. But again, where this book really shines, at least for me, is in the naturalistic descriptions that surround this inevitable face-off. Cooper has a way of describing the natural world in a way that is incredibly dynamic and fresh, as if his descriptions are doing character work, progressing the characterization of the main character of this novel, the natural world of the Scottish Islands. Here's just one description of a snowy landscape that I just particularly liked. Around the sunrise, the sky was already taking on a blue tinge, but nearer the sun itself, whose edge had just crept over the rim of the hills, it glared, a flaxen metal, so that Alistair had to shield his eyes against it. The hills themselves were a complex of light and darkness, as the sunlight caught the upper shoulders, putting their deep-cushioned fields of snow into explosions of brightness, while the lower slopes lay black and blue-white in the last clutches of the night. Everywhere the snow stretched, everywhere its lithe form spread over the sleeping land. This was not the year's death, but a fulfillment of peace, for in the skin of whiteness lay no threats of dark and cold, but the drugged warmth and light of the coming spring. Below the impassive masking, the New Year's harvest lay, breathing softly. The natural world isn't just bleak and brutal, but it preserves hope and comfort, as long as you know how to work with it rather than against it. Before I end, I do want to note that while I did really enjoy this novel a lot, there are some pretty weird conservative ideologies here that are a bit tiresome and heavy-handed. The fear of foreigners and the fear of anything new is really at the heart of the relationship between Alistar and Anshanach. But this is alleviated a bit by the kind of folkloric structure of this novel, and because Anshanach is actually quite evil. He isn't then really a foreign person, but a symbol of foreignness. He's less of an individual person and more of a force. Hey, so I'm editing this back now, and I think I might have stressed this point just a bit too much, as this sort of paradigm is complicated quite a bit by Anshanach's own name, which is, of course, a Gallic name. And there are plenty of traditional stories and fables and folklore about the Shanach in Ireland and Scotland. And so it's obviously a bit more complicated than just Anshanach embodying foreignness, as by nature of his name, he also in a lot of ways embodies a form of nativeness. Also, it's worth pointing out that Anshanach also speaks in the same form of Scottish dialect that Alistair Moore speaks in. And in fact, I was doing a bit of research on the word Shanach, and I'm not an expert in Old Irish at all, but it is an Old Irish word, and it seems to come from a Proto-Celtic word, Shinos, pardon the pronunciation, but that word means old one. I'll leave a link to a good video of a guy that I serendipitously stumbled upon, of a guy talking about the etymology of this word particularly. But this is all to say that I think I simplified Anshanach's character a bit too much in my review here. But I'm going to leave it in rather than re-record the entire video, because I do still think that Anshanach does, in a lot of ways, embody a sort of outsiderness, and there is some, I think, xenophobia at the kind of heart of this conflict. It's how this character just sort of appears on the horizon and then comes in and begins to take over the island that Alistair Moore is staying on. But this is all to say that I just think that Anshanach's character is more worthy of a more complicated and nuanced analysis than I initially gave him in this video. So yeah, if you've read this book, please let me know your take on his character. Anyways, back to the video. But again, there is undoubtedly a good versus evil prescription placed on these two opposing characters. Alistair, the noble Scotsman of the land protecting his birthright, and Anshanach, the conniving foreigner who threatens to take away everything that Alistair, his entire lineage, has worked to preserve. And so all of this does, when you sort of zoom out, does come across as pretty conservative and pretty xenophobic. And it also makes the sort of outcome of this plot rather predictable. But this latter point, the predictability of it, isn't necessarily a bad thing, as, I mean, of course we know how it's going to turn out. We're all living in the 21st century. We know what happens to most yeoman farmers, because we live in a world where giant conglomerates control everything and the individual farmer really can't subsist on their own, at least not in most cases. And so while I certainly disagree vehemently with some of the xenophobic politics here, there is something to lament here, as Alistar, like Gunnar of Hlíðarendi from Njáls saga, is a man out of place, a man from a different time, doomed to extinction. He doesn't fit into the modern world. He belongs to the past. With these reservations in mind, I do still really recommend this novel though, especially if you enjoy nature writing, and especially the sort of nature writing that you get from Northern Europe. Cooper's writing is pretty intoxicating, and I found myself really dreaming that I was alone on an island in the Hebrides or something like that. As harsh and brutal as it might be, there is something so beautiful about those stark landscapes. And as you can see, I immediately picked up the other 3 books of his that have been published that I could find. And I'm really eager to read them, as each of them really take place in a different time and place, and I think it's really interesting. We have this sort of pre-modern Northern European setting with the Hornfellow, Iceland in the Men at Axlir, and then another one taking place in, I think, Scotland. And I mean, an author who is clearly inspired by the Icelandic sagas, how could I resist? I want to thank Orville over on Instagram for bringing Dominic Cooper to my attention as he reached out and recommended this book specifically to me. And I'm happy he did, because I haven't seen anyone else talking about Dominic Cooper, but I think that A lot of people would like his books quite a bit. He's flown under my radar at least, but I really look forward to reading more by him. And I look forward to returning to the dead of winter, some cold winter night in the future, as the atmosphere of this book is just, it's pretty incredible. So let me know if you've read Dominic Cooper or what you think about this book. But for now, thanks for watching.